Today, guys, we're going to look at Lecture 15 in our Causes of the American Revolution series. I've titled The Empire Strikes Back, the Coercive Acts of 1774. Now, last time we looked at the Boston Tea Party in 1773 and we identified the cause, the triggers, and the consequences of this. In short, we identified that the cause of the Boston Tea Party was the Tea Act in 1773, and this was triggered by Lord North's tea tax in 1772, Sam Adams's Committees of Correspondence, and also the East India Company's economic slump in 1773. We identified that there was many consequences to the Boston Tea Party, such as a new widespread organized resistance by the colonists, as depicted and displayed by Sam Adams's Committees of Correspondence. The colonists portrayed themselves as Indians in that visual source that we looked at, identifying or trying to portray themselves as Indians, meaning possibly symbolically that they were trying to be independent and powerful. And then we also identified that there was a destruction of British tea, which cost the Britons a lot of money. And finally, that Boston had become a new radical colony, more radical than any of the other colonies. And this was a reason for parliamentary sanctions on the Bostonians, which would come in the form of the Coercive Acts, which we're going to look at today. Our learning intention is to be able to explain the Coercive Acts by identifying their causes and consequences on the American colonists. And if you're following in your textbook, you can read pages 110. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of the 4 acts that actually create what we call the Coercive Acts. The first of these was the Boston Port Act, introduced on the 31st of March 1774. And in a nutshell, it was to close Boston Harbor to all importation ships until the city of Boston paid the East India Company and British Customs Authority for the amount of tea that was poured into Boston Harbor. So what Britain is pretty much trying to do here is close off any way for the Boston citizens, especially those who were part of the Tea Party, from trade, and they were trying to pretty much lock them down. Remember that the colonies really relied on and survived on the idea or their ability to trade with the British, but also the French, the Dutch, the Spanish. And so removing that ability from Boston citizens really is forcing them to become indebted to the British. As we can see in the quote below my dot point, they actually take this very, very seriously, the British. An extract from the Coercive Acts itself says, from and after the first day of June 1774, it shall not be lawful for any person or persons whatsoever to load or put or cause or procure to be loaded or put off or from any quay, wharf, or other place within the said town of Boston, or in or upon any part of the shore of the bay commonly called the harbour of Boston, or in or upon any island, creek, landing place, bank, or other place within the said bay, or headlands, into any ship, vessel, lighter, boat, or bottom, any goods, wares, or merchandise whatsoever, to be transported or carried into any other country, province, or place whatsoever, or into any other part of the said province of the Massachusetts Bay in New England. So as we can see, it's a very detailed sanction on behalf of the British. They are pretty much not allowing the Boston citizens and the merchants especially to trade with anyone at any time, in or out, importation or exportation. They are completely removed from their ability to freely trade their property, and this could be seen as a obstruction of the natural right of property, liberty, and life. But we can talk about this at another time. All I wanted to show you here, though, is pretty much just how strict the Boston citizens had to, or how strict the coercive acts were on the Boston people through the Boston Port Act. It's a very significant act because it pretty much imprisons the citizens of Boston. Our next act that was introduced was the Massachusetts Government Act, May 20th, 1774. And this, I'm going to ask you to recall your Enlightenment theory, the idea, or one of the ideas that we should study history to gain a better knowledge and progress further. I wonder if you guys can identify how this act is very similar to one in the past. So the Massachusetts Government Act replaced Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson with Military General Thomas Gage, which we've been introduced to before. He was the character who heard from Thomas Preston about what occurred during the Boston Massacre. Thomas Gage is pretty much the British military representative based in the colonies. The Government Act also removed the Massachusetts Colonial Charter of Government, shutting down any American government in Massachusetts. So pretty much the ability or the authority or the legislation that Massachusetts was pretty much living by on their own, they weren't allowed to abide by that anymore, and it pretty much didn't exist. The colony of Massachusetts became a subjected British colony. All the other colonies are still British, however, they're living by their own legislatures, they have their own charters of government. So in this case, Massachusetts has lost all that and now have to do exactly what the British want. Now, coming back to what I said when I flicked over the slide, this sounds very similar to the Dominion of New England. Remember how King James sent a military officer to govern the territory of New England because out of fear that the New Englanders were becoming too independent. And so the governor got given the authority and the ability to legislate as he wished. Eventually that led to, or it didn't survive very long because of the Glorious Revolution, but the Americans have experienced, and especially the Bostonians, because they're part of New England, the people of Massachusetts have once experienced something like this before. And so when the Government Act is introduced, it rings a lot of bells for them, and they quickly realize this is exactly what King James did to us almost 100 years ago. We've got the Administration of Justice Act of May 20th, 1774, introduced the same day as the Massachusetts Government Act. And pretty much the Americans called this the Murder Act. It allowed any villain, in Americans' perspective, any villain, or from the British perspective, a loyalist, who is put on trial by Americans for breaking the law, they could request a trial in Great Britain. So what this act is trying to prevent is the people of Massachusetts putting loyalists or any other British subject who is in favour of the monarch. It's trying to prevent the Massachusetts people from putting them in a law trial and convicting them of something that isn't 100% true, or trying to prevent the actual trial from being corrupted by the Massachusetts people. And so the Administration of Justice Act pretty much just gave everyone who's in favour of the monarch and everyone who's in favour of British Parliament and legislation free passage to leave Massachusetts at any time if they were challenged or imprisoned or jailed because they weren't doing what the greater community of Massachusetts wanted them to do. The quote reads, "If it shall appear to the satisfaction of the governor, who is now Thomas Gage, that an independent trial cannot be held within the province, it shall be lawful for the governor." So we have to understand that a fair trial is another one of these natural rights wasn't explicitly communicated in our natural rights, but definitely communicated in the British Constitution. Again, the idea of fair trial wasn't upheld during the reign of King James. And so, what Britain is trying to do here is ensure that those who are loyalist or to Great Britain, that they are given a fair trial as per the English Bill of Rights slash the British Constitution. So it's actually a very interesting juxtaposition because we got the Massachusetts Government Act, which I just talked about, which is kind of recreating the Dominion of New England. And now we've got the Administration of Justice Act, which is trying to prevent pretty much the illegal occupation or operations of King James, who didn't allow fair trial by jury. And finally, we've got the Mutiny or Quartering Act. We've already seen this act before. It came in just after the French and Indian War was introduced, just as the French and Indian War finished, sorry. The Mutiny Act / Quartering Act was revised on June 2nd, 1774, and pretty much allowed, sorry, I've just noticed that that first dot point isn't correct. Ignore the first dot point, go to the second dot point. The revised edition of the Mutiny Act pretty much introduced the idea that the new governor, Thomas Gage, could forcibly take possession of buildings in Boston for the sake of accommodating British soldiers. So this didn't include private homes. However, it gave Thomas Gage a lot more power to just walk in and claim property from the people of Massachusetts. And that was a big problem in the eyes of the people of Massachusetts. One, because they're losing their property, but also because the property was being used to house standing armies. And the standing armies, as we know, are not looked upon very fondly by the Massachusetts people because, or any American, in fact, because they're seen as a threat. They're seen as law enforcement from Britain to ensure that Britain's legislation is being, implemented, and if necessary, it will be implemented by force. Also, standing armies or British soldiers also have the history of acts such as the Boston Massacre. So all this kind of stuff is really fresh in the minds of the people of Massachusetts, and so a new Mutiny Act or a new Quartering Act is not looked upon very fondly by the people of Massachusetts. So from this we get these coercive acts, or what the Americans call the Intolerable Acts of 1774. The cause of this is pretty much the British desire to restrain American colonists, and again, as we've seen time and time again, to ensure that they maintain power and authority over the Americans. But unlike the taxes, this is direct legislation on just a colony of Massachusetts, pretty much restraining all their natural rights that they have previously entertained. The triggers, obviously, is Lord North, who introduces all four of these acts, and in total, the coercive acts. And another trigger is obviously the Boston Tea Party. Without this, the coercive acts may not have even been discussed in the first place. Now, there are obviously 4 acts, so there will be 4 consequences. The first consequence is the shutting down of Boston Harbor, and this leaves economic issues for the merchants in Massachusetts. The second consequence is the military government in Boston, and whether or not this is a new Dominion of New England or really just a Dominion of Massachusetts. And it starts to question the freedom and the natural rights of the Americans. And I guess whether or not the Americans deserve those, and that's probably our counter argument. And we have to remember to think about these things from 2 angles, not just from the Americans' perspective, but from the British perspective too. Do the Americans really deserve their natural rights, do they really deserve what is given to them through the British Constitution? The third consequence is that it's provided protection from opposition to British loyalists. So any loyalist through the Justice Act, if they feel threatened or if they have been put on trial, they are further protected from that trial being rigged, and they're allowed to flee to Great Britain and have a fair trial under the British Constitution. And finally, the fourth consequence is now British can now claim property for their purposes except for private homes. So the British have literally just removed the property away from the people of Massachusetts. And again, I don't really have to go over this, but I'll just make a point that that would naturally really irritate the people of Boston, because again, they're seeing one of their natural rights being removed from them. Next time, we're going to look at the coercive acts again, but we're going to look at an image analysis. So I've shown you some primary sources today. I'm going to talk to you guys about the coercive acts through the use of an image analysis next time. If you've got any questions, please post them in the Google Classroom and I'll get back to you. Otherwise, you can see me in class and we can discuss them in person.